We're starting off a year with a series on our environment, starting with one of our most precious resources, water. Most of you know there have been varying degrees of dispute about how much water we have in our county to provide for many important needs: farming, fishing, municipalities, and landowners. Hard to believe there could be a problem in the midst of our rainy winter. But today, Eric Hirst is here to give us a technical explanation for possible water shortages, and Hank Kastner will talk about the politics and emotions surrounding this issue. This program is intended to be educational. It's impossible in the short time period that we have to hear every facet of this very broad issue. Our hope is to give you, our audience, a place to start in understanding what all the fuss is about. City Club sponsors civil discussions on important issues, and we ask that you respect the speakers and each other as we have this conversation. There'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Our guest bios are on the table. We decided we'd save some time for that. And so I'm just going to introduce Eric Hirst, who will present first, and then on his left is Hank Kastner. Please welcome them to City Club.
Okay. Well, you might want to hold your applause till the end, see if it's worthwhile. Our relationship with water is, depending on your perspective, either funny or insane. Water is life. It's more important than any other resource, perhaps other than air, essential for human life, plants, and animals. But on the other hand, our treatment of water is to disregard, even disdain it. We tend to focus much more on cable TV, internet service, our smartphones, electricity and gas than we do on water, even though water is really important. Jane's right. I'm not going to cover everything because I don't know everything. I know hardly anything. These are the points I'm going to try to make. The main one being that water is a scarce resource. It's scarce not year-round, but it's scarce in the summer. During the summer, we have low stream flows and almost no precipitation. And at the very same time, ironically, demand for water is high, primarily because of irrigation, primarily because of agricultural irrigation. Fortunately, there are many options that are available to improve stream flow. And they exist on both the supply side and the demand side, and I'll talk a little bit about both sets of options. And several projects, particularly in the agricultural sector, are completed and underway, showing that these options can work. However, my sense is that we have no overall plan, no strategy that is being implemented to actually do these things. There are lots of bits and pieces going on, but they don't add up to a coherent whole. And my sense is it's because we have a leadership crisis. That is, there's an absence of leadership on these issues. My candidates would be Whatcom County and or Ecology to take that leadership role. Let's agree on what we're talking about. This is a map that shows the Nooksack River Basin. And like all river basins, it does not follow political jurisdictions. So the Nooksack River itself extends down into Skagit County, as well as encompassing most of Whatcom County, plus parts of western Whatcom County are outside the Nooksack River Basin. But they're all part of what's called WIRA 1. WIRA stands for Water Resources Inventory Area. It's a wonderful topic to raise at cocktail parties if you want to be left alone. So I said earlier that we have lots of water on an annual basis. We get 40 to 100 inches of precipitation a year. And the glaciers and the snowpack up on Mount Baker, they store the water in the winter for release during the spring and early summer. And in addition to surface waters, we also have several aquifers, in particular a large Sumas Abbotsford aquifer. The quantity issues we face, as I just said, are seasonal. Low summer stream flows and rain and higher summer use, especially for irrigation. These limitations in the summer cause problems. Salmon and other wildlife suffer. They suffer from high water temperatures, low dissolved oxygen. They have less habitat. If you've got less water, there's less volume in the streams, and the low flows can lead to barriers to migration, so the fish can't go upstream. The State Department of Ecology has an in-stream flow rule, and it is not being met on most summer days. I'll show that on the next slide. and as a consequence, salmon and other fish are doing poorly, and because of that, several species are on the federal endangered species list. And because there are not enough salmon, the orca whales are doing poorly. And my sense is that all of these problems will get worse over time unless we do something, because population continues to grow, and we're already seeing the effects of global climate change. They will continue to get worse, and you'll learn a lot more about that next month. So this slide shows the percentage of days each month that the State Department of Ecology's 1985 in-stream flow rule is not being met. And you can see in the summer, July, August, September, and into October, the majority of the days the rule is not being met. The situation is actually worse than indicated here because the deficit, that is the percentage by which the stream flow is below what it ought to be, is substantial. It's not just a few percent, it's actually quite high. And as I said earlier, there's a big difference in when we use water. This chart shows who uses water and when. And you can see that there's this enormous peak in the summer, and it is driven primarily by agricultural irrigation, that red dashed line. Unfortunately, the data that we have on actual water use is pretty sketchy. In principle, we have billing data for all customers of water utilities, municipalities, water districts, and water associations. However, we have almost no data publicly available for either agriculture, which, as we just saw on the prior slide, is by far the most important water use in the county, nor for households that use a rural well, households out in the county that get water from a well. Even where we do have data, there is no entity that collects, organizes, analyzes, and reports the results to the public on this water use. I grew up professionally in the electricity industry. There's tons of data on electricity. You can get it at the state level, the federal level, every month, every quarter, every year. That just does not exist for water. Why are these data important? As I said before, agricultural irrigation is by far the most important use of water during the summer. And there are several methods available to estimate ag water use, but they differ substantially one from another. So we have estimates, but we don't really know how much they use. The data available from water utilities could provide important insights on who uses water for what purposes, when and where, what the trends are over time. You know, are we, as year by year goes on, are we using more water or less? And then my pet interest, which is how to run and improve water use efficiency programs. As I mentioned earlier, there are two key factors that affect water use: population growth, which is about 2% a year in Whatcom County, and the effects of climate change. My guess is, although I don't know this, that climate change will increase population growth. As living in the desert Southwest gets more and more complicated and harsh, people are going to say, look at the Northwest, they get all that rain in the winter, and they're going to want to move up here. So what I'd like to do is briefly review historical data on some of these factors to infer what might happen in the future. And basically, demand, I think, is going to get higher because population's growing, we have less summer rainfall, and higher air temperatures. And those last two factors, rainfall and temperatures, mean that we're going to need more water for irrigation. And then we're also going to have lower flows because of less rainfall and smaller glacier mass. So this shows the flows on the Nooksack River at Ferndale from 1967 through 2017. And there's a lot of year-to-year volatility. But behind that, there is a trend. There's a discernible, real trend that shows a decline in stream flow of about 1% a year. Well, 1% is hardly anything. But over 10 years, that's 10%. And over 20 years, it's something like 25% because it compounds. You've seen lots of pictures of glaciers, and I don't have one here, but this chart shows what's happened to glaciers throughout the North Cascades, not just Mount Baker. And glacier mass has declined by about 30%, almost a third, in the last 3 decades or so. My worry is, and you'll hear more about this next month, my one attempt at levity, are we ignoring the signs of global climate change? I wish I could play the piano. I mentioned that we could improve stream flows either on the supply side or the demand side. And let me talk a little bit about the supply side. There are several options available that could increase stream flows. One option that's been discussed would be to take water from the public utility district intake in Ferndale and pipe it upstream, that is north towards Canada, and then dump it into either Bertrand Creek or Fish Trap Creek or both, where it would be available to increase stream flows and or for human use. Another possibility, which many farmers have done, is to switch from surface water intake to groundwater. There was an experiment last fall to use the groundwater wells that farmers use for irrigation. At the end of the irrigation season, use that well to pump water into the creek. And that was tried on Bertrand Creek, and it worked. Another possibility that's being explored now is to use the Blaine Birch Bay deep aquifer, which is several hundred feet underground, to pump water east. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. We could build reservoirs, off-channel storage, to store winter water for summer use, or if we were willing to spend the money, we could do desalination. My problem with these options is that they lack details on the costs, how much water would be made available, where they would work, and in particular, how cost-effective they would be in terms of dollar per acre foot. In my decades with the electricity industry, every project was compared against every other project in terms of cost effectiveness. What is this going to cost in terms of cents per kilowatt hour? For reasons I don't understand, we never do that on water, at least not here. The Birch Bay Water and Sewer District got a grant from the State Department of Ecology for several $100,000 to drill 3 deep wells. One of them didn't pan out, but the other 2 produced a lot of cold, clear water. And so it looks like that water could be used. You could either pump it south towards Cherry Point or pump it east into the Nooksack River Basin. But in spite of my entreaties to Dan Isis, who heads the Water and Sewer District, there have to date been no estimates of what it would cost to do any of this and how cost effective it would be. On the demand side, we could either use more efficient technologies, or we could change operating practices. At the utility level, a big option, an important option, is to reduce distribution system losses. A typical utility takes water out of a creek or out of wells, runs it through a water treatment plant, and then sends it out through all of these underground pipes. Well, they're going to leak, and leakage is typically 10–15%. So if we can reduce that leakage, it not only saves money, but it reduces the amount of water we have to take out. Another option is to use economics. Instead of charging the same rate for for water year-round, or the same rate regardless of how much water you use, why not have seasonal rates where you pay more for water in the summer and less in the winter, and the more you use, the more you pay. Ferndale and Linden, those bastions of progressivism, do have inclining block rate structures. Bellingham, to its discredit, I think, doesn't have that. We have a uniform rate. No matter how much water you use in Bellingham, you're going to pay the same rate. I think that's shameful. Other options are to reduce residential and commercial outdoor water uses. Just as there are options for agricultural irrigation that I'll talk about in a minute, so too are there options for reducing outdoor water use in other sectors. And then industrial practice, particularly cooling towers. Typically, you run water through a cooling tower in what's called a once-through system. You just run it through, but there's no reason why you can't recirculate. And for agriculture, you can improve or replace inefficient systems with efficient systems in some cases, but that really depends on the crop. But regardless of crop, you can improve irrigation scheduling and improve irrigation equipment maintenance. Let me give a couple of examples of that. This is an example of relatively inefficient overhead irrigation. Now, you've all driven around out in the county in the summer, and you see these beautiful arcs of water. I mean, it's really very aesthetically pleasing, but a lot of that water is lost to evaporation, and if it's windy, then you're going to have a lot of water over here, too much, and not enough over here, so you'll have uneven distribution. Whereas if you can use drip irrigation, there you've got these little tubes with these little emitters that put water right into the roots of the crop. You don't have any of that evaporative loss, and you don't have the flooding that you can get when it's windy. The problem with drip is it's expensive to put in, and if you have a crop like corn or grass that you have to replant every year, then you'd have to either take out the drip irrigation system or you'd wind up tearing it up. On the residential side, you could use this little timer, that little device on the right-hand side. I consider myself very conscientious about efficiency in terms of resource use, but I can't tell you how many times I say, I'm going to water for a couple hours. I go out at 6:30 in the morning, turn on the sprinkler, but at 8:30 I've forgotten. And it's not till 10:30 or 11 that I remember. But with this little device, that's not a problem. So I think there are terrific opportunities in terms of efficiency. There are also some obstacles to water use efficiency. The main one is the lack of economic incentive. The price for water is either very low, or if you're a farmer and you pump your own, or you draw from a well, there's really no explicit price. I mean, you're paying for the electricity or the diesel fuel to pump it, but it's not nearly as vivid, as salient as it is if you got a bill every month. And as I mentioned before, we have serious lack of data on actual water use, particularly for agricultural irrigation. To me, the biggest obstacle, and this is throughout the entire sector, is tradition, that we have historically viewed water as an abundant resource, even an infinite resource, particularly in the Northwest. And my pitch is that's not true. It may never have been true, but it's certainly not true now. There are also some problems with state water law. If I have time, I will talk about one of them that's really important. That's relinquishment, use it or lose it for farmers. And then there's a lack of institutional support. Let me give an example of the economics, the peculiar economics of water. If you go to the local grocery store and buy a bottle of water, it's going to cost you about $7 a gallon. If you buy water from the City of Bellingham and you use 1 extra gallon, it's going to cost you $0.003. So what is water worth? Is it worth $7 a gallon, or is it worth $0.003 a gallon? Well, presumably somewhere in between there. But we can't decide what projects we want to do, which ones are cost effective, which ones make sense, unless we have some sense of what water is actually worth. One of the big obstacles, maybe the biggest obstacle, is Washington state water law, which I think makes very little sense today. It might have made sense 102 years ago when water law began to be put in place. Here are the basic principles of state water law. The water is owned by the people. It's not by private entities. When you drink a glass of water, you're just borrowing it from the people, and you have to return it. The state, acting through the Department of Ecology, acts on behalf of people in granting and regulating water rights. The problems I see with water rights are, first of all, it's prior appropriation, first in time, first in use. So you have vintage rights, which is unlike what we have for any other resource. The water rights that the state gives you are free. You don't have to pay for them. They're permanent. They last forever. Who else is going to give you something that you get to keep forever, never have to pay back? It's a fixed quantity. It's so many acre feet, even though the amount of water we have every year varies. It depends on how much snow and rain we have each year. And as I said before, the seniority system. And I think we could make a lot of progress if we could somehow or other transform, revamp state water law. The big problem would be the transition period, getting from here to there. And the other problem is that no one really seems to have an appetite for addressing that issue. Here's one peculiarity in state water law that I think is really a major obstacle to improving efficiency, and that is what's called relinquishment, or use it or lose it. It applies to agriculture only, not to the munis and the other utilities. If a farmer has the right to a certain amount of water, say 100 acre feet a year, but because of improvements in his practices, he's only using 60 acre feet a year. If he uses 60 acre feet a year for 5 years running, the state is required to take that other 40 acre feet away. Well, that's a strong disincentive to do anything that would reduce water use. It is also a strong disincentive to meter, because if you actually metered your water use, then it would be unambiguous how much you're using. Whereas if you're relying on estimates, well, you might be able to fudge that around. So I would love to see our relinquishment eliminated. Another important issue associated with water law is federal. Tribal water rights are important, probably the most important rights. And they were codified in a 1908 Supreme Court decision called the Winters Doctrine that recognized two sets of tribal treaty rights. One was for use on their reservation for their normal purposes, agriculture, industry, residential, whatever. And the other right, which is probably much larger, is protecting in-stream flows to support fish and other environmental resources. And we're clearly not doing that. And these are the most senior water rights around. They extend back to time immemorial. But in order to know what rights the the Native Americans have, we need to do a quantification and an adjudication. And that has never been done in Whatcom County. There were efforts made in the mid-2000s to negotiate with the tribes on Bertrand Creek and Middle Fork, but they failed. The negotiations were confidential, so the public doesn't know why they failed. We don't have the lessons learned. In 2001, both the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack Indian Tribe wrote to the Department of Interior and asked for assistance. Come here and help quantify what our water rights are. And that has never been acted on. And I can't believe that the Trump administration is going to do anything that the Obama administration didn't. A couple of years ago, the Lummi Nation was negotiating directly with Ecology and farmers and others, but again, the results and process are not public, so I don't know what's going on there. Another important issue in Whatcom County is unpermitted water use by the agricultural sector. I want to be clear, this is not the fault of the farmers any more than anyone else. It's a historical situation that has been allowed by the State Department of Ecology to fester for 30-plus years. About 19,000 acres are irrigated in Whatcom County without approval from Ecology. This is almost 40% of total irrigated ag lands. And that amounts to about 30,000 acre-feet of water, about 44% of the total. And as I mentioned, it's been a problem since Ecology issued its 1985 in-stream flow rule. Ecology at the time pretty much told the farmers, it's okay, go ahead and keep using water. We'll get this solved in the next few years. But Ecology hasn't. Fortunately, in my view, this is an issue that I think the farmers, if given permission from Ecology, could solve on their own. There are 6 agricultural watershed improvement districts in the county, and they include more than 90% of the irrigated land and the water use. And I think these WIDs would be ideal for resolving this issue because they are government entities, so they have the power to tax. Most important, since they were created by the farmers and run for the farmers, they are trusted by the farmers. And, this is also key, they contain more than enough water rights to cover both permitted and unpermitted water use. You probably can't read the details of the graph on the right. I just like to show off my ability to make PowerPoint charts. The left-hand bar is the amount of authorized water rights in each of the 6 WIDs. And you can see it's the tallest bar by far. The next one is permitted water use, the next is unpermitted water use, and the one on the right is surplus water rights. That is the amount of water rights in each of the WIDs minus the permitted and unpermitted water use. And those are all plus signs. So there is, within each of the WIDs, enough water rights that if they made trades or sales or leases, they would be able to cover all of the water use in that watershed improvement district. You could hear a pin drop. Are you all asleep? Well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, there are lots of government entities involved with water in Whatcom County, but no one's in charge. You got the City of Bellingham, Lummi Nation, Nooksack, State Department of Ecology. I didn't put Fish and Wildlife up there, but that also belongs. Whatcom County Public Utility District number 1. But as I said, no one's in charge. And this slide, which is by far my favorite in the talk, how not to organize to accomplish anything. So I know you can't read this slide, and that's intentional. I knew that. No, seriously. So the title of this chart is called Clarification. Clarification, this is supposed to show how the local organizations in Whatcom County work together to solve water problems. I will give $100 to anybody who can provide a cogent, coherent explanation of how this chart works. You heard it here. Well, let me wrap up so that you can hear Hank and so we can get to your Q&A, which is really important. So my bottom line is that we have water quantity problems in Whatcom County. Salmon populations have declined dramatically over the past several decades, and we need to reverse that trend and restore salmon and other wildlife populations, and to meet tribal treaty obligations. The stream flows set by Ecology in 1985 are not being met in the summer. Actually, the situation is worse than that. Utah State University did a lot of work for WIRA 1, remember that? There'll be a quiz later, about 20 years after the Ecology Rule was put in place, and it showed that required stream flows are even higher than the level set in Ecology. So my conclusion is that flows are too low and human water use is too high. What are we going to do about that? Well, one problem in terms of finding solutions is data gaps. We don't have enough information of how much water fish and other wildlife need in the creeks in Nooksack River. I think we're pretty close. We don't know how much water the tribes are entitled to, and we don't know how much farmers really need for irrigation. The bigger problem is there is no short-term incentive to take action. In my view, the status quo is unsustainable because fish are doing so poorly, and we know that climate change and population growth are going to make the situation worse. But I think what's preventing progress is a concern or even fear about an unknown future. People know that the current situation is unsustainable, but they don't know what the future is going to bring. We're better off just staying where we are. Maybe there'll be a question about the planning unit and what's going on in terms of developing an update to the watershed management plan. But to me, that's showing clearly this year and last year that we're not making progress. And again, I think the key agencies, which in my view are Ecology and Whatcom County, they're not acting. The short-term uncertainties are overriding the long-term benefits. And I should admit that it's pretty easy for me to say, Jack Lowes, the county executive, or Doug Allen, the head of the Bellingham Field Office of Ecology, ought to be doing something. But I'm not the one who would be doing something. And then finally, what I started out with, water is life. It's essential for all life. We can't go on pretending it's free and inexhaustible. And now Hank is going to explain what all this means.
That's what you call a tough act to follow, right?
Okay, if there are any questions.
We do want to get to questions. Eric's given you a lot already. He's talked about opportunities and obstacles. Unfortunately, I'm here to give you a little more about why these things are so hard to do. And then we're going to talk about it, as we usually do. So I'm going to give you a short version of my perspective as we answer questions, because you deserve to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. In one picture, a lot of words, or a few big words. I want to give you that quick impression. So I want to apologize about two things starting out. One is that I'm going to talk about things being complicated, and I'm going to try to make it really simple so we can talk about it in 5 minutes. So there's a contradiction there, I admit it. The other thing is I'm going to try to stick to a script, because if I try to converse about this, as we usually do, it'll take way too long. So I'm going to give you an example of how I would answer one of the obvious questions, which Eric referred to a little bit already. Why is this so hard? He's got a lot of ideas about things that could be improved. Why doesn't it happen? He's shown you the big box chart that gives you one view of that. My answer, in a few words, is the human factors involved. So that's what I'm going to talk about in 5 or 10 minutes by explaining some of this. First, it's complicated. I think Eric's probably given you an impression of some ideas about why that is. Two things about complication. One, and why that's a problem, why that's that is an obstacle in itself. We prefer simple problems, right? Simple problems, simple solutions, move on. So it runs counter to the way all of us would prefer to see things. The second thing is about the scope of how we need to address these issues in this county about water supply and water demand. And that is, anything that we come up with needs to be county-wide, county community-wide. And that has its own challenges. In just a minute, I'm going to tell you why I think there's also some advantages there for us about trying to do this across our county with different communities and different views, but we'll get to that in a minute. The other thing is about simple problems is we like having clear boundaries on the issue. Single things out and they're easier to address. You start looking at the bigger picture and they get more difficult. So the other thing I have up there is it's hard because it's complicated, but also because it's systemic. Now, that has a lot of meanings. I want to talk about three things really about the systemic elements here. One of the key things that I mean in terms of being systemic is that the factors are interdependent. So you try to address any of the issues that Eric talked about, some of the solutions, and you find out pretty quickly that you're running across other parts, other issues in the bigger picture of water supply and water demand. That's a basic element of systemic issues, and we just need to face up to it. Obviously, we can't solve it all at once, but as you address individual issues across the board, we have to keep in mind that it really is all interdependent, and you're going to run across some of those other issues. Thank you. The other thing I would mention about systemic issues is they tend not to have boundaries. So that runs against our interest in getting things clearly defined so that we can single it out and address it. So you have to be conscious of where things are affecting you outside of those boundaries that you're working within. So it's another awareness thing. Another way to look at the systemic issue question is Eric has spent his time talking about basically the natural systems involved, the water supply, and why that's often not adequate for uses. I guess in a sense, I'm addressing the human factors, and they are just factors. It's not explaining the whole picture, but awareness is important. So moving on. The dilemma is more about stories and less about facts. Three things about stories. One, what I'm talking about is understanding the stories that people live by is how you get to understanding their values and beliefs. And that runs to a number of things that we'll get to. Second is the stories are how our brains and our culture catalog our values and beliefs. It's not, it's not a bullet list. Here's what I believe, here's what I value. It's essentially a summation of our life experience, people, experiences, groups. It all comes together in narratives, stories, whatever you want to call it, but that's how we hold tight our values and beliefs. Third is I'm not talking about using stories for persuasion. That's a real thing, and that's often what people think about when they think about the power of stories is how it can be used to influence, and certainly marketers and politicians have known that for decades, but that's not what I'm talking about here. So stories, less about facts, what that's about. Facts are not a magic thing. If I have a few big facts, that doesn't mean I win. I would say that what we're talking about here is information that we choose to believe is what we call a fact. And otherwise, it's not a fact. So how do we arrive at that? It's filtered through our values and beliefs. And that's why it's so important to understand what someone's filter is. And the way to understand that is to understand the stories that they have accumulated through their life that affect how they filter the information they get and decide what's a fact and what's not. So resolution, I say, will require a consensus, not winning. Most people in most stakeholder groups, that's how I would define a consensus. It's too much to ask to get everybody, but if you get most people in most stakeholder groups, maybe you've got a consensus you can work with. I mentioned a Whatcom advantage earlier. I think that if we can actually develop a strong consensus around an action, resolution on any of the water issues in Whatcom County, that will be a very powerful thing in the state of Washington. And it will pull resources, and it will make changes in legislation if needed, like relinquishment. But it's going to take a consensus, not winning, which I would consider the norm. I mean, that's how most of our institutions are set up, organizations, and winning is a majority. And what does that do? That winner majority creates losers. And when you have losers, what you have is a constituency to come back and just keep trying because they want to be the winners. That's not an effective way to make basic change. And once you have that threat out there, then nobody wants to be the loser, right? So what's the best strategy? Not to lose. And I think a lot of what Eric has described in terms of the history of the water issues over the last decades is just that, let's try not to lose anything and see where this goes. Okay, so that brings me to what do we do? And I suggest that the key is listening and not advocating. 3 things about listening. What we're talking about is listening to understand and understand the values and beliefs of others with other ideas. And you can't just ask for their bullet points. You need to ask about the stories that lie behind those values and beliefs. That also implies that you need to share your stories and your values and beliefs if you expect others to be listening to you. So don't just think about your bullet points, but think about what stories are really key for your beliefs and share that with others. And the third thing, if we do those things, then why are we listening? We're listening to start a conversation that creates that consensus that will be powerful enough to make some real change. And you have to do that with others and not dictate it. And that's the purpose of the listening. And not advocating, which has the goal of winning, essentially. And story becomes an information message, crafted to persuade a perceived majority in order to get that win. I suggest that we've been advocating for winning and relying on facts for several decades, and it hasn't worked, and that we should change. So let's get on with questions.
Well, I was intrigued. And I was thinking about some things that the League of Women Voters have done on this issue. Of course, we're known for advocacy, but we're also known for trying to bring different groups together. And many of you know about the Klamath Dam issue. And in that sense, that was where two different entities, the tribes that were trying to have a lot of water at the end of the river so they could fish, and the agricultural people at the top of the river who needed water to farm, finally got together. It didn't all happen just immediately, but they came together, and the dams are coming down there. So it took a long, long time and a long time of listening, so I get it. One of the things that I get from people as a question is, when we mention water scarcity to anybody, people always remarked, we have all this rain, how could we not have water? And this may be a dumb question, but is there a way to capture the drenching winter rains that we have? Where I come from, we had, cisterns and big places where we kept water. We don't, Lake Whatcom is our reservoir, more or less. Can we have reservoirs?
Sure you can have reservoirs. How much are you willing to pay? There was a study done in 1997 of part of the WIRA process. Pete Willing headed it, that looked at reservoirs off channel, so outside the streams, not building dams, but putting it. And they concluded it was very, very expensive to do that. It's great to talk about doing things, but who's going to pay? Is water worth $7 a gallon, or is it worth $0.003 a gallon?
Which brings us back to your point about metering and finding out how much water is worth and charging more. So who is an entity that we go to and say, do something? You're telling us the county doesn't do anything, Ecology doesn't do anything. These are all the places where we look for leadership.
I didn't say the county's not doing anything.
Well,
I didn't say Ecology's not doing anything. Jane said that. Look, Jane, I can get in enough trouble on my own. I don't need your help. Just ask my daughter, who's back there. My concern is that while the county and Ecology and the farmers and others, the PUD, are all doing lots of things, it doesn't hang together. Mm-hmm. It's like there's a piece of the puzzle over here, and there's another one here, and there's one on the floor over here. And damn it, let's do what the electric utility industry does, which is develop an integrated resource plan where you put all of these different options into one pot, and what comes out of it is a coherent plan that makes sense. It says these are the things we're going to do this year, next year, in 5 years, and in 10 years.
And who does that?
Nobody.
It takes leadership. Who should be responsible for that?
Well, I think the county or Ecology at the local level could be the ones to do it. And I think the county is the one who ought to do it. Thank God Jack Loud's is not here.
Okay, we're going to open this up to the audience. Okay.
This is a terrific problem. We all know it. I was participating 25 years ago when the planning was begun to accomplish all these things that were laid out on the program. We're not there yet. I love the Native American tribes. I'm a strong supporter of their merits and their needs, but there's one little factor that we ran into and are still running into. The federal court ruled that all of us must keep enough water in the streams to supply the salmon for the natives. How much is that?
That's Marian Bedell, who, as she said, has been active for decades. You ask a great question. I think we don't know the answer.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this presentation to us. It's very informational. I got a simple question. So when you put the chart up there and you can see that there's a real tension between what agriculture's needs are during August and September and what the salmon need at the exact same time. So I guess my question is, there's two ways for ag to get water. One's to pull it out of a well, and one's to suck it out of a creek or a river or stream. So can you give me some idea in August and September, how much is coming out of wells versus how much is coming out of streams?
Most ag water use is coming from wells, and the farmers are eager and willing to shift that even further in an effort to improve stream flows. But again, it costs money. In that case, the primary cost is regulatory. Getting approval from the State Department of Ecology to transfer a water right from surface to ground is not a done deal. It takes a lot of effort and time.
But that's a good example of where a strong consensus out of this county for across communities could make a big difference in what we accomplish statewide.
I'd like to know if Whatcom County is in the process of trying to establish the amount of usage between the farms and the residential, and if they are they, how far are they? Are they close to figuring it out?
The answer is very simple, no.
Because so much of it is not metered, basically. It's a lot of estimation to even have a notional idea, right?
I have a question here. You've talked about how many different interests there are involved in this. It's certainly true. And rather than me indicating some, I know that people have been at work, and I know we have some local successes. Will you please describe 2 examples of at least recent successes where people have been working together to help resolve this problem?
Okay, I get to do one, Hank gets to do the other. Let's see if I pick the one that Hank would have picked anyway. Well, I have often been a critic of agriculture because they use so much water, but I also have to give the farmers a lot of credit for actually tackling these problems, and I appreciate the question from Tim Douglas. So the example I'll give is stream augmentation. Henry Bierling, who is here somewhere, maybe he can speak more to this, and others in the ag community have for years sought permission from the State Department of Ecology to, at the end of the irrigation system, use those irrigation wells to pump water up and then put it into a creek. And they did that last September in Bertrand Creek. And the time period was too short to be certain, but it looked like it worked. If you put roughly 1 CFS of water, a cubic foot per second of water, into Bertrand Creek up here, it actually shows up as almost 1 CFS downstream. So there's a case where it worked. It was a lot of hard work on the part of farmers, but they did. Now, that's a tiny demonstration. We need to do a lot more of that if we're really going to have an effect. But to me, that's a successful example.
And I would say that's a successful start. There have been a number of questions raised about taking that to a scale where it would make a big difference, but you've got to have those successes to get a start, and I think that's why that's a good example. The one I would mention, and we really didn't make this explicit up front, but we are only talking about a small part of water issues in this county because we're not talking about water quality, we're not talking about the broader issues of restoring salmon. So my example is actually more from the water quality side, but I think it's significant because it did involve tribal interests as well, and I'm talking about the Portage Bay Partnership, which was an agreement between farmers and Lummi Nation to work together on water quality issues. Again, it was a healthy start and demonstrated the kind of sharing of values and interests that it would take for a consensus on anything. It's also an example of something that has not followed through for a number of reasons that are indicative of why we still have a lot of work to do. But that was a significant effort that was not lost, is not lost, and was a good demonstration of the kind of work that's going to be necessary.
You've talked a fair amount about in-stream flows and about the possibility of moving groundwater into the stream. I'm curious, what do we know about the state of the aquifer in this county? And to the extent we know anything, is there any regulation being imposed as far as who's drawing from that aquifer and how much they can draw?
There's not just one aquifer, so it's one of those complicated questions. And in any given place, you can have a surface water aquifer and several levels. The project that Eric mentioned in the Birch Bay area was actually a very deep aquifer, 300 feet down, that is a much different case than the water that's normally being drawn from wells. So what's known, it depends on where you are. There's a groundwater model that's being developed, sponsored by the county, that is building all the available knowledge to understand as much as we can with the information that we have at this point. It's limited, but it's another one of those healthy starts. It's if we had a representative groundwater model for Whatcom County, we would be much further down the road to at least being able to evaluate some of the problems that we have. So it's a very good question, and we need a lot more information than what we have, basically.
I agree with what Hank said. I would add one thing. The 1985 in-stream flow rule that Ecology put in place is silent on groundwater. So there's regulation of stream surface waters, but not on groundwater. It's a huge omission. And Ecology realized that about 15 years after, and in all of its in-stream flow rules issued after about the year 2000, they do include groundwater, but they haven't had the resources or the political will to go back and redo the Nooksack Rule, which I think they really need to do.
Yes, can you quantify the size of the aquifers in Abbotsford and Blaine? Are they the size of Lake Michigan, or are they Hannah Creek size? Number one. Number two, we already own a bunch of land up by Mount Baker. It's federally owned. Could not a reservoir be made up there to control river levels?
Go for it.
I have no idea how big the Sumas Abbotsford aquifer is. What I will say, which is a little bit off topic, I'm trying to answer your question with provide an answer to a question you didn't ask. Unlike a lot of the Midwest and the South, we are not mining the aquifers here. That is, while we may draw down the aquifers during the summer, every winter they come back up. And if you just drive north on the Guide or Hannigan up towards Linden, you'll see, water standing in the fields, which is an indication that the aquifer has actually come to the surface. I know that doesn't answer your question, but it's a useful tidbit.
Reservoir question?
I answered the reservoir question earlier. I don't have an answer to a specific location for a reservoir, but my sense is that building a reservoir anywhere in the county would be hugely expensive, and the environmental obstacles would be even greater.
And you have many interests that would benefit if there was a viable idea, and really I don't know that anything has come to the surface yet. So.
Thank you. I was surprised when you stated earlier that, progressive Linden, they meter their water, whereas parochial Bellingham doesn't. That's one thing that stuck in my mind.
I didn't, stop, John. I didn't say that they don't meter the water. We charge a uniform rate in Bellingham.
That's what I'm after. I know that in Point Roberts, having lived there 20 years and being a water commissioner, we meter our water, and we use about 60 gallons per person per day, and it was about $30 a month. I mean, it was reflected in your water bill. Whereas living in Canada, crossing Canada, it's similar to what I guess they have in Bellingham, because they, you get a kind of a flat rate. But don't you think if you wanted to achieve some kind of harmony between the people out in the farming areas and the city folks, that everybody should be paying their fair share? I mean, if you're paying for the water, you're going to be using less. And I'm surprised that there haven't been more political initiatives with the city to meter the water and to charge for it, as they have been doing in Point Roberts since 1989.
John, I'm not sure what your question is, because There was a 2003 water law that requires every utility to meter every one of its customers. So both Bellingham and Linden and everybody else that sells water through a utility meters. And they also all charge for it. So I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Do you get a water bill then every month, or like in Point Roberts every 2 months, for the water that you use?
Yes, Bellingham does that. My point earlier was that in Linden and Ferndale and lots of other places, the more you use, the more you pay per gallon. So there's an incentive to conserve just built into the economics of this rate structure. But Bellingham has not done that, to its shame, I think.
To be fair, let me just say one more thing about that. The water bill that you get in Bellingham is a large number, and the usage factor in that is relatively very small. So the kind of variation that you're talking about making is not going to be so apparent in the Bellingham water bill. So that's a real challenge for coming up with the right mechanism for Bellingham.
I am happy to be at City Club, but as a former farmer, I want to point out that our agriculture community is sometimes not represented here. I don't know if Mr. Bierlink is here. I would like to point out that ag is whipsawed by fuel costs, as we all are, water, EPA, emissions. They struggle in many ways that we are not aware of here as city members. So if they're here, if members of ag are here, I vote that we give them a hand of appreciation for all they're doing and all they try to do for us. Thank you.
This is a question actually for Hank. In particular, I really appreciated what you had to say about the need to listen to stories before we can even hope to come to consensus. And I'd like some suggestions from you about how we might find places where we can hear those deep stories.
Well, of course, that is going to depend on who we are. If we're talking about probably the majority here from Bellingham, it takes a real effort, right? Because we've got quite a nice bubble boundary built around our place here oftentimes. But the willingness, there are plenty of partners out there in other communities, whether you're talking about the South Fork foothills or the Everson foothills or the northern lowlands. I would look to community organizations which exist everywhere. There are events around the city, the library, the churches, other civic organizations. The watershed improvement districts are a great way, if you really want to know more about the water issues in the various watersheds, it's a great way to hear those stories. I appreciate the earlier comment about what's not represented here. So the message is exactly what you're talking about, is make the effort. I'd be happy to talk to individuals who have particular interests, but there's certainly opportunities. It's the sincerity in wanting to make the effort that will make the big difference.
Henry, are you over there somewhere? I think I saw you come in.
To the right.
If you want to see a little bit more what the ag community is involved, it's agwaterboard.com is just sort of our overall website, and all of our different WIDs are underneath that, and it's not kept up as well as we are. We're kind of redoing it after the first of the year, but you get a sense of some of the things we're working on. But I would really like to know from both Hank and Eric's perspective is, other than just calling Jack Louse and Doug, tell them to get busy and take leadership, what is it that the community can do to kind of move us over the hump? Because we're at a point where a lot of good things can happen, and we just got to get them to happen. So what does it take to get momentum?
I'd like Hank to answer that one. That's a great question. Do you want to start?
I like the idea of not looking to individuals, especially designated leaders. I think that a number of the entities that we've talked about, whether it's the Ag Water Board, an individual WID, even the planning unit that's been working on the well issues. I think any network of people that can stand up and say, we represent this county community, and have other people stand up with them and say, yeah, this is the representative, and have an activity, change, something that they want to do. It's a little like what I said about Whatcom County. If the whole county stands up and with a consensus, things will happen in this state, whether it's money or political change. That could happen within this county too, if any entity that really represented that cross-county constituency. So it could come from one that we don't know about yet, or it could, if the Ag Water Board was working hard at showing up at the City Club and other things, that's beyond your scope, I know that, but it's going to be something like that, where somebody starts it and brings in the others, you build that consensus. That's my view.
I wanted to address what Henry said, and thanks for this very great talk and bringing a balanced approach to the whole problem and trying to leave the politics out. I think that's a great thing. Two things. One is that what we have inherited over the last 25 years, addressing that chart you had, the RIA 1 and Watershed Management Board and everything, we do not have in our county one body who can decide. There is consensus from planning. I don't want to get into weeds, but I just want to tell you there are 3 or 4 bodies. They can individually vote and pass on. It's like a circle. It goes on, but that never stops anywhere that, okay, these are the people, they're going to make a final decision. And the second thing I want to bring out that over the last 4 years, talking to individual stakeholders, environmental people, ag people, tribes, everybody, I think everybody is aware of the problem. They are aware of the problem or the expectations of the other side. But what is lacking is trust. I think that something is lacking when they get together. They don't want to say something that I may regret. And that's the fear, is between groups. Everybody knows the problem. If you go individually, I found everybody understands what is lacking, what needs to get done. But nobody wants to open up and say something because, oh, am I giving up something for nothing? That's what the issue is. And if we have one body to decide, I think many good things can happen. We have more trust deficit than water deficit.
I want to respond to that. Jane, I want to respond. I'd like to respond. First of all, that was Satpal Sidhu, who's a member of the Whatcom County Council. I agree with him. Hank alluded to the planning process that's underway now, hopefully about to be completed in response to state water law that was passed in January of last year to deal with rural exempt wells. There's a chart that I didn't show that has several columns. And on the left is a column where the work gets done, where the technical work gets done. And then you've got the planning unit to approve it. And then you have the watershed staff team. And then you have the watershed management team. And then you have the watershed management board. And then you have the county council. And that's what Satpal's talking about, that you need approval from everybody, but nobody's doing the work and nobody is the final decision maker. And in response to Henry's question, I think if someone in ecology high up enough or someone in the county said, damn it, we're going to get this done. I'm going to knock heads and make sure that you meet these deadlines and come up with a plan, maybe it'll work.
Hi, my name's Lynn Billington. I'm a civil engineer that's always worked in environmental, and having worked for government and consulting and for industry, I think we're going to have a rule, a state rule, and I really do think that pushes, whether it's industry or whether it's government, it pulls them together, but we're going to need a rule to figure this out. And, having seen industry will, or maybe it's agriculture, whoever, will drag their feet a little bit No, because nobody wants to give up, but I do think that we're going to need some kind of a rule that we work under to get this resolved. And that will bring all the parties to the table, in my opinion. I don't know, Eric, what do you think, or Hank?
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, would you write that rule for us and we'll work on it?
Good point.
It's you.
Beavers?
You and then you.
You knew that was coming. So, Eric, you talked about the cost of building reservoirs, and I'd like, if you would care to comment on what services in the area of building reservoirs beavers might provide throughout Whatcom County.
You know that I have no answer to that question, Michael. I don't know anything about beaver.
Well, I'd be happy to address beavers because they were the original architects of the water system in Whatcom County. If you go back far enough, the whole lowlands was wetlands, and the beaver were doing their best to keep it that way. And you know, the research is there if you're looking for the facts and figures. But it's not compatible with the society we have in Whatcom County. I mean, that's the dilemma in coexisting with beavers in this county. And we manage it right now with all kinds of typical behaviors on the part of us, not very well. But the fact is, it's not compatible with the land use that we have. So that's the kind of, I mean, that's probably one of the tougher issues, is to come up with what's the best way to do that? Because if you're looking for a spectrum of values and behaviors on the questions involved, it's pretty broad, and it's not something that everyone knows a whole lot about. So I think we're at the beginning stage. There's a new book that Michael knows about called Eager, about beavers. It's just been published. It's going to be very popular, I predict, in people learning more about this, but there's no silver bullets to that, as much as we like what they do in the right places at the right time.
Okay, we have one last question over here.
Oh, well, luckily I got under the wire. I'd like to make a plug for an election that's coming up very quickly. It's for the Whatcom County Conservation District. If you wish to vote in this election with a mail-in ballot, you have to go online and make your request by February the 8th. And maybe the two candidates that are running for the board, the two, I guess they're supervisors, not quite sure on this. I think hopefully they will have an opportunity to debate each other and or express their views on particular issues of water management within Whatcom County.
Thank you all for coming today.